Of course, if Isaac ever does his next book, when Harry Seldon gets together with his crowd will consist of nobody. He'll be there all alone.
Isaac Asimov will never be all alone. He just published another book.
That's his 201st.
Yeah.
Only one?
He tried it once.
We are a panel without a moderator, apparently, which means that we're going to be immoderate. And for science fiction,
Speak
for
for
science
yourself,
fiction.
Sturgeon. I'm always moderate.
Oh, sure. Nobody ever said that Lester Del Rey was opinionated. Nobody ever had to. Anyway, immoderation is SOP for science fiction. And the more I learn about science fiction, the more fascinated I am by that very thing, by the fact that outside of poetry, there is no other field which has so few limits. No horizons, no skies, no limitations whatsoever, particularly since the sexual breakthrough. Are we talking about the future, which did not, could not, or might not happen, or words to that effect? Right?
The future as she was. Cliff and I were kicking it around, came to the conclusion we're talking about the future we were dealing with back in the 40s, say before World War II and things like that. Nice little things like the world will be utterly destroyed by 1952.
That's right, yeah. And
Well, it was, yes. As a matter of fact, I've got gray hairs from it still.
sure.
They're turning, though. They're going back to brown again.
As a matter of fact, the world most of us knew was destroyed in 1952, because that was the year when paperback publishing got into science fiction and began taking it over, and it made one hell of a difference.
And not necessarily a bad difference.
No, no.
I don't know. I'd like to see the short stories come back. Well, they are coming back.
I'd like to see good short stories come back.
But as far as predicting the future is concerned, science fiction has been notably bad. It's been credited with all kinds of wonderful predictions. Because when we make predictions that come true, everybody knows it, and a very tiny percentage. And all of the glop that we turn out and the stuff that's absolutely impossible and unlikely and so on just gets pretty well forgotten. But we get credit for inventing the submarine and for inventing the airplane and for inventing the electric telephone and all kinds of stuff. And that's kind of nice. But do you remember Judith Merrill's wonderful, wonderful story called That Only a Mother? A superb story. And yet she did make the error of putting dates on everything. That by 1954, it was written in 1939. And sometime in the 60s, she had not only pretty well a post-atomic ruin situation, but she had all sorts of gimmicks like highlines, rolling roads, and so on. All these things are in her story, things which had not yet come about. We can be incredibly wrong. We really can, as science fiction writers.
Generally speaking, anybody who puts on a date on it is wrong.
Yeah,
That's
that's
the
true.
worst thing you can do in a science fiction story.
I wrote a story in the late 30s about television, and I like to do my homework, and I studied the thing as much as possible to find out how it was done. And I wrote a sequel which involved the coming of color television. And I knew enough about the really enormous difficulties of transmitting color that I put it 200 years in the future. And before the ink was dry in the magazines, they had color television sets in Radio City. Not big ones and not good ones, but they were there. I mean, those technical problems had been solved. Willie Lay, God bless him, once gave me a stack of perfectly beautiful drawings. I'd love to see them again. Because of a television show I was doing, they wanted something visual. And it was a folio of drawings of the year 1950, which had been done in 1900. And the reasoning behind those predictions was flawless. I mean, the guy had skyscrapers in there, he had flying machines, he had, whole new cities of the future. The women on the streets, however, had skirts down to the ground. The skyscrapers were 9 stories high because nobody could ever think of a building which would be any higher than that. Who's going to walk that many stairs? The most fascinating thing of all was a flying machine, a logical, possible, practical flying machine. It was a dirigible with a big air screw in the back, and it was powered by a horse on a turntable. And yet you can't vote. And, you laugh. The word for that is quaint, right? There are a lot of things that are going to be quaint, things that we're living with right now and predictions we're making. One of the things that I think within 2 decades is going to be called absolutely quaint is the idea of power from atomic fission, which is a quaint idea to begin with. And a lot of people have been chanting that. Fusion is possible, and also a lot of other alternatives. But fission, it was a dog right from the beginning. And ultimately, now it's beginning to prove out to be that. But people are going to look back 20 years from now in absolute amazement that we could ever have been sidetracked into something like that. I mean, at such great cost. The predictions we make are pretty far out. But Lady Jane wears a watch which does day and date and hours and minutes, also a stopwatch to 100th of a second, and it's got a solar cell in it that sucks up light and recharges the batteries. I know of no science fiction story which contains a device like that. It's something that the science fiction writer utterly overlooked. As a matter of fact, most of the whole field of microelectronics we just absolutely overlooked. And so technology has taken a quantum leap way ahead of the science fiction writer, and he's scrambling like hell to catch up with it. It is going to change the face of the earth, the whole microelectronics business. It's going to have grass growing on our freeways. It won't be necessary to go to work every day because you'll be working in a corner of your own home with probably a holographic device where you can see the boss or the customer or the goods or whatever without ever leaving the place. And that's going to change our whole way of living and our whole way of thinking. And so it goes. Technology is something rather frightening for the science fiction writer to keep up with.
I think the one thing that we have overlooked is that science fiction no longer deals exclusively with science or technology. We are writing different kind of science fiction than we wrote even 15 years ago. Certainly different kind of science fiction than we wrote 20 or 25 years ago. We're not caught up in gadgets. We're not particularly caught up, except for a few of us, in science. We're writing, I suppose you could call it speculative future. Where is mankind going, and why is it going there? Are there life forms out in the universe? Will we ever contact them? What will they have to say to us? What will they do to our way of life? I was talking with Gordy here before we came in, and I said there was one thing that we wrote about back in the early 30s that has happened, and I don't think anybody has ever considered that. I had not considered it until I knew that I was going to be on this panel and began going back, trying to figure out what we had done wrong or what we hadn't done. But back in the 1930s, there were a few writers. I believe one of them was David Lasser, would that be right?
Could be.
They're writing about technocracy, which was a government, a religion, a creed, a cult, based, might have been, based on based on technology. Well, I submit that we've had that now. We don't call it that. It didn't stem for the same reasons or with the same motives that these boys back in the 30s were writing about, but we have got a technical civilization, a technical way of life now, which amounts to technocracy. Mm-hmm. Our entire lives are ruled by computers, by new business methods, by new by new ways of doing business, I think maybe that's something we should think about. That science fiction was right back in the 1930s when it was talking about a technological civilization. God knows we've got technological civilization now.
We were right, perhaps, in our idea of technology, but technocracy was one of the blind ideas that came out of the desperation of the Depression.
Mm-hmm.
The basic idea of technocracy was not only that you would have the technical advances, but that all government would really be done by the technicians. And it was Nat Schuckner who wrote a series of stories for Wonder Stories in 1933, I think it was, 32 or 33, on technocracy. The only trouble is that they completely overlooked the fact that the technologist, the engineer and the scientist is a specialist. And specialists are pretty hopeless when they get outside of their own purview. No more hopeless than the politicians who has no purview, but we, on the other hand, back in 1933, Larry Manning was writing stories about the pollution that was going to affect the earth, and he didn't do a bad job of it. The exhaustion of minerals and oil, which sounds reasonably up to date today. We had a lot of futures that didn't happen, but the interesting thing to me is that we never predicted the social outcome of a single damned thing we invented in those stories. We talked about television. We never talked about the social impact on that, on our children, on a great many of our other habits, on the coverage of the news so that we saw wars as they happened and reacted differently from what we ever had before. That was not taken into account. Nobody that I know of really thought about the fact that television would be the Roman amphitheater where the lions entertained the crowd. Interestingly enough, of course, we invented a huge, wide-scale welfare state to take care of the indigent just about the same time we invented a new form of the old games, so that we've got the two things that resulted in the downfall of Roman civilization. Does that mean ours is going to fall? Not necessarily. It may mean that ours has fallen already. We talked about the cities in two forms. We completely overlooked the social position of the city, really. We had the brave new city with its flying buttresses through the air and the helicopters, millions of helicopters overhead. What that did to the air on the ground, God knows. All marvelous roadways all over, and these great cars streaming along. Cars probably 25, 30 feet long from the pictures that were done of them. How they were going to stack them all in, nobody figured out. Or else we talked about the ruin of cities completely, the desolation of cities, the people foraging in the ruins of cities. Nobody seemed to think that the city might become a ruin in which more people than ever lived, which is what happened in a great many of our cities today, that no matter what you do to the city, no matter how miserable conditions may seem to be there, people will go right on flocking to it because of the social fact that the city is a center of human beings, and human beings cluster automatically. They've clustered since the days that they first constructed a town, which incidentally gave the people who thought of the first chance to do other than provide food for themselves and therefore built civilization. People don't really think things through. And one of Campbell's favorite examples was that when people invented the automobile in stories, and it was invented long and long ago in stories before it was in fact, they gave marvelous accounts of all kinds of machines going, I guess, along the same old roads and so on. Nobody thought of the need of building modern roadways. Nobody thought of what it would do to the city. Nobody thought of what mobility would do to the population, that you wouldn't have the people clustering around their little factory anymore. They foresaw the machines, but they didn't see the consequences of it. And I think that is the big area we have always goofed on. That and economics, because not one of us in the old days ever considered the economics of building spaceships, how much it would really cost, who would be the one to build it, that kind of money is handled by governments, not by private individuals. Economics and social consequences, no. And the truth of the matter is, if we did think about it, we wouldn't have put it in the stories because it would have made damn bad fiction.
You know, it's not surprising that any writer writing at any time is going to be dead wrong about 30, 40 years and look very foolish very often. Just a little side issue, one of our gimmicks in this particular field that's been used and reused is the business of getting 3 or 4 science fiction writers together, having them write novelettes or novellas on one topic or with one idea. I've been involved in some of them, so has everybody else. The thing is, they come out, the stories come out differently, and people say, my, how different. What they should be saying is, look, it's amazing how close they are. You get any 2 writers to write within a country mile of each other, and you're doing well. And that comes down to
no, they stand and talk with each other about the stories they're going to write if they're within a mile of each other.
And they never get them ready. Yeah. The point is that you can go back all the blinking way. There's a cartoon in the Punch of about 1950 showing a traffic jam in London. And it's a perfect traffic jam. It's a busy intersection, and anybody's risking life and limb to try and cross the street. The only trouble is everybody is riding on different sizes and shapes of railway locomotives, which is the way they saw it. Now, here's the thing. This isn't the basis of difference. In the 1930s, there was a radio program called Lorenzo Jones, one of the daytime serials. And his hero was a happy, impecunious, unrealistic, friendly, lovable, but otherwise useless inventor. And he represented one of the American dreams. And great inventions were done in the backyard. That's why so many of these doggone early stories had people building spaceships in their backyards and going to the moon. At that time, people were in love with gadgets. They were in love with the hardware end of technology. Now we've got it, we aren't in love with it, and we go around questioning the doggone thing, but we're very dependent upon it. It's been pointed out that the whole Earth catalog, in essence, if you squint closely at it, is a manual on how to use technology to pretend you're doing without it. This is this is one of the things we're up against. One of the things that wasn't seen in its total usefulness was our present highway system. We use cars the way people in the 30s only dreamed of using them. Fandom back in the 30s and 40s, we wrote long letters to each other. I wrote long letters, and I'm somebody who can't write a letter from year to year. We wrote long letters because we never hoped to see each other. You know, we might live as much as 500 miles apart, and once in a lifetime. In fact, if I remember rightly, in those days, some of the early conventions, people would meet each other who had been corresponding for years. And they were like a couple of strange dogs. They'd sort of circle each other. My God, does he look like that? He looks crazy. That's right, that's right. And finally, they might settle down. But, well, how many came by either plane or car to get here? Well, there you are. All of you who raised your hands wouldn't be here if you were back in the days when you had to be damn near rich to own a car and planes were out of the question.
I don't know, Gordy. My grandfather got from the East Coast here back in the 1860s.
But he was a Del Rey.
I have to say...
Somebody probably told him he couldn't go. The point I'm trying to make is this, that once your attitude has changed, the historical attitude that existed before becomes a little bit unthinkable. And the attitude that is to come is inconceivable by definition, but you come to it. And when you come to it, everything is a little bit out of phase again. Whatever is going to be the thing that everybody trips over at about 2010 is going to be something that we probably aren't paying very much attention to now, even if it's on the scene at all. But it only becomes something that shifts us around when we begin to take it for granted, like the business of the technology and the whole Earth catalog. We can study the past all we like. It will help us at looking into the future, but it won't give us a roadmap.
I think you're right, Gordon, certainly with that last. I got to say in defense of some of the earlier science fiction writers, however, that they didn't overlook these things. Even, as Lester very aptly pointed out, some of those things would not make good fiction. But I remember a cover on a Galaxy in 1952 with a very futuristic city and everything was very streamlined and so on. And in the foreground, there are two people riding in a pedicab. And it was as sharp a prediction of energy shortage as I've ever seen anywhere. I wish I could remember who wrote that story.
It was Gravy Planet Right by Paul and Kornbluth. That's right.
Yeah. And we're a fair couple of heads for prediction, incidentally, those two. And I remember The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster. That was about, what, 1917? In which he certainly pointed out the machine cracking and lemonade coming out of the tea dispenser and stuff like that. I was in New York 5 years ago, I think it is, and I dialed somebody on the phone, and I got somebody with a Spanish accent, and I always blame myself. I dialed wrong, and I tried again and got the same party, and finally called the operator and asked for some assistance, and she told me very calmly that happens all the time now. It's overflow. The T-bar connections just can't keep up with the flood of calls, and they switch over and throw in all kinds of random numbers, and you reach parties that you never meant to. Yeah. And I thought of E.M. Forster right away. My gosh, the machine is stopping. It really is.
The trouble is it doesn't stop. It goes ahead and makes a mistake instead.
Yeah. And in the area of mistakes, by the way, Fred Pohl said something that was really shattering, a really penetrating remark. He said that humanity never solves any of its problems. It simply substitutes new ones. And that is really something to ponder, because the more you think about it, the heavier that gets.
Well, I don't know about that. I think it has pretty successfully solved the menace from wolves in the United States.
True, right. No, it's an overstatement in a lot of ways. We don't have to live in cities with this open sewers running down the middle of the street and people throwing night jars out the second floor windows. And we don't, as Ray Bradbury very vividly pointed out, we don't have a ritual of going to the graveyard every Saturday and putting flowers on the graves of our little brothers and sisters who died of all kinds of diseases at the age of 2 and 3 and so on. This virtually never happens except where the automobile is involved. And we have indeed come a long way, and we have indeed solved a good many problems. But by and large, in the larger issues, Fred is absolutely right when he says that. We do tend to create new problems instead of solving old ones.
The one insoluble problem that remains confronting humankind is how to govern humankind. We haven't even begun to solve that one. And I don't think even growing peanuts is enough experience to give us the answer to it.
I would differ a little bit, not with what Lester said, but with the wisdom of governing humankind. I'm an old newspaper man, and at one time I had a job for a few weeks when somebody else was off on vacation or something, of putting together a public opinion polls that the paper ran. I read these answers that came in, the statistics too, but the pollers had taken a lot of random sample answers to different questions. And so help me God, you could read through 150 or 200 of these random answers to the same question, you get exactly or approximately the same answer. We're a bunch of sheep. We don't need to be governed. We're governed too much as it is. We need to find some way in which we can express some of our own personality and some individuality.
I think in that, though, Silas McKinley a long time ago predicted one of the trends of society. So long as the weapon that is most commonly used is a weapon that is used by the common man will rule. When the weapon that is most commonly used is not feasible for the use of the common man does not rule.
Do you think we're basically ungovernable as a species?
No, the trouble is we're too damn governable, and I think that's what Cliff was getting at. We basically, there are a few people here and there who want independence, who want freedom. Most people do not. They want security. It may be damn bad security, but they want security, and they'll do anything for security. And they also have still built in is the ancient worship of kings. The chieftain must be right. In our case, it's the government.
The economic system and the political system finally beat you down to where you accept what they tell you to do rather than hassle ineffectively and against the stone wall. For many years, I frothed and fumed and was unlivable with for weeks when I was making out my income tax. I didn't resent paying the money, which I should have resented. I resented the government turning me into a bookkeeper. This year, for the first time, I made out my income tax. It was no smaller than it's ever been. And I found myself being very philosophical about it. Well, I said this bundle of money goes to Israel, and this bundle goes to Egypt, and this goes to the man down the street who hasn't got the guts to go out and get a job and to care for his own family, and this goes to something else. I have caved into the system. I never did anything about it before, but I had the good grace to be damn mad about it. I'm not even mad about it anymore. I'm philosophical.
Oh, that's spooky. It really is. I suddenly thought of an experiment that I read about where in a psychology class, there was one person there who, unbeknownst to himself, was the patsy. Everybody else was informed. And essentially what the professor did was we put 5 spots on a blackboard and asked the class to write down on a paper how many spots there were. And everybody in the class wrote down 4. This one person gave an honest answer, 5. And then in a discussion period, and they kept looking at these pieces of paper with the numbers on them, everybody zeroed in on this one person and said, "Are you sure? I mean, do you remember that? Why, all of us saw 4. Why did you write down 5? And ultimately, that person will cave in, say, "Me, I must have been wrong," and will absolutely deny the evidence of his own senses just because everybody else said something different. And it works almost every single time. Unbelievable how few people will hold out when 35 people say, "You were wrong, you didn't see what you saw."
Ted, that's a cultural thing tied into this particular different culture. You get just the opposite doggone results. We're in the end, again, this technological business, we're in the end of a long chain of command. And the farther down the line you are, the less individual control you have over what's going on.
The sad part of it is that we can't blame this on technology. It is the opposite of technology that's responsible for this. We're still back there in the huts built outside the cave with our stone weapons when we have to have the leader of the hunt. You absolutely have to have him, and in that kind of a hunt, you absolutely have to follow him, even though you disagree with him. We spent a few million years conforming. Technology actually supplies the answer to that. It is possible now for the man who does not agree to find the full answers. You can, well, all right, the biggest secret we have supposedly is how to build a hydrogen bomb, and a number of people have found that.
I have
all
to
available.
interject what John Campbell said about that. He said to the FBI when they came to visit him in his office, "Listen, there are no secrets but nature's secrets, and nature is a blabbermouth."
That's right. Well, and so is everybody else and everything else. You can, if you are in disagreement with a consensus opinion, you can find the answer almost always if you work hard enough at it. There was a time when that was not true. There was a time when the only man who knew the answers, the best answer that could be found at the time, was the witch doctor, the shaman. And he really did probably know better than anybody else what was going on. It was his study. Nobody else had the time for it. Today you do not have to accept that, but people go right on accepting it. And if you'll go back to the stories oh, the early stories of science fiction, you will find that their idea of social progress was simply to get bigger and bigger and more of the same. Well, obviously, the bigger you get, the worse the consensus gets and the more binding it gets. We were a little wrong about that.
The doggone thing is that, well, some years, this is a little bit around Robin Hood's barn, but bear with me. Some years ago, I did a short story about a man who got a book he didn't order from a book club, and in the process of fighting it, got extra. Okay. The point is, in real life nowadays, a lot of us faced with a situation like this where, okay, it costs $3.95, or you can spend 3 weeks writing letters that are answered by computer and fighting with it. It's easier to pay the $3.95. More and more of this is being done. The incidents, I am told, and this is just hearsay, I'm going to do a little looking up and find out if it's true. The instance of people who are asking for consultations when they don't like what their immediate doctor tells them is going down, not up. We are becoming a more dependent society, partially because we've got so many more people, and partially because we're used to pulling a lever, socially as well as in a machine sense. And it's building a different type of character. Within my own lifetime, right here in this area where you are right now, the character of the people as a people have changed. I'm not talking about the business of formerly 10 blocks outside this center city area, all houses were unlocked, literally, front and back doors. You never locked the door unless you went away for vacation. And sometimes you even forgot to do it then. Now you'd have to be out in the exurbs not to lock, and probably you'd lock there for fear of people coming along on snowmobiles in the wintertime and breaking in. Whether they break in more or less is a little bit beside the point. The point is everybody now does this automatically without thinking. Okay? And this changes us a little bit. Like it or not, the physics of our society has forced us into a position where we can't afford the independence, the personal independence we had before. And when you put anything under a lid, it starts to bulge out in other ways. The fact you people are at something like this, or the fact that there are tremendous hordes of people converting to fundamentalist religions and things like this all over the place, is an example of the pot beginning to boil and its lid is chattering a little bit. The pressure is being felt. And a lot of these doggone things are happening. These are the things that are really going to move us in the next 10, 20 years or so, in my opinion.
I'd like some comment from you about the effect of 16 years of education on everybody else in this room, and how come I assume all of us in here are pretty much not in as condition as everybody else we're here. But you're not addressing the fact that 16 years of having the government teach children really affects how you think and how acquiescent you are.
I have to say right away that according to surveys I read recently, the average child now spends more hours in front of his television set than he does in the classroom. And that's got to be included in his 16 years of education.
That's true.
Anyway.
And also, when he's in the classroom, what is he studying now? Clay modeling? Actually...
It's not as bad as that, Lester, really.
Well, it's pretty bad. My father went to school in a little one-room schoolhouse here in Minnesota a great many years ago. He completed 3 years of study. He was the one who taught me to do algebra. His handwriting was good. His spelling was good. He read easily anything he chose to. He was a better educated man for his 3 years than many of the people who come out of college are today. And he was more interested in things that went on in the world in many ways. Education, if you're thinking that education is toward conformity, it doesn't even do a good job of that if you stop and think of it, because the dropouts are the ones that the teacher didn't succeed with. And a hell of a lot of not only us, but the world at large has dropped out from the teacher's ideas.
I'd like to make a small comment on that from my own family. My son was as close to a high school dropout as I have ever seen in my life. I wanted to send him on to school if he wanted to, and he said he did want to go on to school. I was afraid to send him to the University of Minnesota because I knew what would happen. They put him into General College, and in a year's time he would be flunked out. So they were just starting the community college system here, and he went to Metropolitan Community College here the first year that they had it. This kid could barely read and write. He had no indication, that no idea at all what study was. A few months after going to community college, and he seemed to be getting on all right, he said to me, he said, "Dad, do you know what they call me down at college?" And I thought, oh goodness, what has he done to get some sort of a nickname now? And I said, "No, what do they call you?" He said, "They call me Mr. Simak." They gave the kid some dignity, some self-assurance. He went through junior college, went on to university. He took chemical engineering, which I am told is the toughest curriculum on the campus, not excluding medicine. He was on the dean's list, and today he's a fine engineer. But he certainly didn't get any start in the ordinary schools, the common schools. He got his start when he went to college, and someone called him Mr. Simak.
Nobody. So far as I know, no science fiction writer ever predicted the state of education. The general idea was always the more schooling you could afford to give people, the more educated they would become. I may have rebelled from that a little myself because I'm a college dropout by choice, thank God. But I'm obviously a half-literate man in the world today. No, according to the college standards, I'm a half-literate man because most of the world today goes to college and gets at least a BA.
I'm more illiterate than you are. I'm a high school dropout.
Well, I don't know whether it makes you a better man or not, but it doesn't make you a worse one, obviously.
The title, Null ABC by Patrick McGuire and two-part series was astounding, or 52.
Yeah, I was thinking earlier in science fiction than that, but that time the evidence was beginning to come in. I was thinking of the early days of, the late 20s, early 30s, and so on, when there was, most of the writers in those days did not have a very good education, and they probably were worshiping education because of that.
Now, let's see. I had essentially 5 years in undergraduate because I didn't take the right courses, or World War II came on. I had equivalent of about a year and a half of graduate school. I have to say that in line with what I do nowadays, a good 70% of what I find useful now, and that's being very generous toward my formal education, came outside of that area. In other words, it was things I did myself. I read before, well, I was reading before I went to kindergarten, so that's really not fair. But they didn't teach me to read. And most of the things I picked up after that, I picked up out of books on my own. What it did for me, though, was very useful. It gave me a place to be for a number of years, which, as I say, was very handy because I didn't grow up till I was in my early 30s. No, quite serious. I beg your pardon, sir. Your gray beard gives you some rights. No.
I thought you swapped one bottle for another much earlier than that, Gordy.
Oh, no. This, the thing is, one of the prime examples is as some of you know, I've got a degree in creative writing. I'm, as far as I know, the only writer who has written anywhere near and published the number of books I have that has a degree in creative writing. No, usually it was the kiss of death. For a very good reason. They got people in classes and they started talking to them about control of point of view, which is a very good thing, and a number of other things that are very useful if only you can tell a story first. But they were talking to people who didn't know how to tell a story yet.
Yeah, great.
It's like teaching them how to ice a cake or how to paint a house when they can't build the house or bake the cake. The point is, As long as it is this type of process, and it's a type of process that tries to sap a template over people, education is going to be a yes and gosh affair. It may help, it may hinder. Chances are, where you have somebody unusual, the template is liable not to work rather than to work. One time I had a rule of thumb that said, if it works according to general society, it probably doesn't work for me. Maybe it does, but probably not. However, there is a type of education that I think we may get to, and again, after beating technology over the head, we may come in this route. I like to do a certain type of learning. I would like, for example, to take the Berlitz cram course in one of the languages I don't know. This costs you a young fortune. Last time I checked, it was something like $1,500 a week, 2 to 3 weeks. Corporations pay for it for executives who have to fly to South America and take over a plant down there.
You can get a calculator that does it for you now.
Well, yeah, I don't know how good it is in a hot argument. The thing is that they cram it to you. They hit you with essentially 5 tutors, picking you up at breakfast time, turning you loose at 9 o'clock, wrung out. I happen to like to learn this way, just like I happen to like to write in a berserk sort of deal. What it does point up, though, is the advantage of one-on-one. If you can take each student, treat him as completely different from anybody else who ever tried to learn anything, and give him one good adult to work with him all the way along the line, you stand a good chance, not a certain chance, but a good chance of getting a well-educated adult, provided the teachers are sympathetic and intelligent themselves. The heck of it is, it takes an awful lot of adults to turn out one good student. But that's the ideal.
The trouble with school, though, is that basically it's a process of teaching, not a process of learning. I had a teacher, my first teacher, who believed that there were only certain basic necessities. One was how to learn, and the other one was how to enjoy learning. And she taught that quite successfully. There were some very unbright people in that class, and I was fascinated in high school later watching some of those kids, the kids who were not, well, they weren't exactly subnormal, but they certainly were a low normal. And they came in the top 10% of the high school class. All of her students did, just automatically. The school today teaches you conformity. We all know that. We all take it for granted, but why should we take it for granted? You have true-false answers. There's no shades in a true-false answer. In multiple choices, you may have a slight amount of shading. But the person who's capable of thinking, which is something the schools no longer try to teach, although they did it one time in England and some of the very early schools here, the person who is capable of thinking will see possibilities that do not exist on the test. Which is what should be encouraged and what is heavily discouraged.
The lady has had her hand up.
I don't know how many of you have young relatives who are in school now. I do have sisters that are pretty close to them, always exposed to them. And I'm appalled by the fact that school, they don't even bother teaching learning and you are liking to learn, as you said. They try to teach you a certain amount of discipline, but they fail at that because they have no, you need a certain discipline of yourself to be able to enjoy learning. They can't even teach that. And the fact is that I think it's important, and I think, I'm not sure if you would feel that they can almost no emphasis on the ability to read.
That's right.
And you can get students, even my younger sisters, in a family of voracious readers, do not like to learn.
Well, is that surprising? Have you looked at their textbooks? They are incredibly boring. The schools do pardon? Yes, I agree with your implication there completely. The thing, though, is that when a child of 5, who may be a little too young to enjoy reading in many cases, although not, some kids are ready at 3, some at 7, but a child of 5 comes in there, and the first thing he's given to read is something designed to bore the hell out of him. This is a concerted conspiracy to keep people from reading. No, who cares if Jane throws the ball 40 times on a page? And then, well, I came from an evolution of what was the finest schoolhouse in the world. We had a perfected learning machine at one time. It was known as the one-room schoolhouse. By the time I got there, it was the two-room schoolhouse, and I will defend the one-room schoolhouse for a number of reasons. In the first place, in a good one-room schoolhouse, the teacher didn't have time to make the kids conform, so the teacher had to find a way of holding their interest. In the second place, this was an ancient process of learning that has been thoroughly explored and thoroughly approved psychologically and everything else. It's known as introduction, study, and reinforcement. You came in there, you were sitting, we'll say where you were sitting in the second grade, and you're watching the fourth graders and learning a little bit of what they're doing. Now you get to the fourth grade. You're learning that all over again, but meantime you're being reinforced on what you learned in the second grade, and now you're watching what the seventh graders are doing. This is a fine process of teaching. Also, of course, the young ones came in there, and if they were out of hand, the older ones disciplined them. It was a continuous process of a self-feeding process of discipline, so you didn't have the problems. And the loss of the one or two-room schoolhouse, about the same thing happened in the two-room schoolhouse, actually. The loss of that, I think, was a grave disservice to the country. It required, if anything, more dedicated teachers, however, to handle this diverse group. Incidentally, my initial school, the one that I went to, the first, the grades from 1 to 4, there were 47 people in that grade, and the teacher did not think there were too many.
Excuse me, but we just got a signal. We got 5 minutes left, and there are one or two things that I'd like to blurt out very quickly. One of them is that it isn't a complete desert, Lester. Here and there pops up the teacher. I have a kid at Santa Cruz University. He has a chemistry professor, one of the most extraordinary men I've ever met in my life. He's written a textbook. His name, by the way, is Grant Delbert Venerable III, and that's pretty heavy all by itself. And Venerable's textbook in chemistry, the first third of it is almost totally given up to the idea of finding out how you learn. What he posits is, and it's just exactly what that young lady said, what he posits is that if you can learn how you learn, you will create a situation into which the data will then fall, sucked in by a vacuum. And you don't have to array data out and then with an effort pull them down one by one and bone up on them and sweat all night. You learn how you learn and the data will fall right into it. And he does prove his point, too, by the kind of work he's doing. An extraordinary teacher.
There are excellent teachers today, Ted, some really superb teachers, but most of them are limited by the curriculum they're forced to adopt, and they're crying about it.
I have to agree. Yeah, absolutely. And the one other thing that I wanted to blurt out is simply this. We were talking earlier about the future and about science fiction and so on. We tend to overlook, as science fiction readers and science fiction writers, exactly the nature of the science fiction mentality, the kind of thing that makes a science fiction writer write what he does, and the kind of people who fall into it and get obsessed by it. But I had this sudden vision. Given an L5, an O'Neill colony, and it's out in space, it's going to have a science fiction writer aboard. And the thing that really fascinates me is, what is he going to be writing? He's not going to be writing about orbits or meteor holes or whatnot. He's going to be writing about something else. He's going to take it and he's going to jump ahead and he's going to do possibilities and probabilities. I am fascinated by what the science fiction writer who was born and bred on an O'Neill colony is going to be writing about. That gives us an insight as to what we are really here in this room and what we do and how we think.
Have we got time for one quick anecdote about a good teacher? Okay, very briefly. World War II, something called ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program. We were already in uniform. They were going to send us back to college and make technical officers out of us. We ended at Grinnell, Iowa. The colonel in charge of the unit at Grinnell, Iowa wanted to, he was lieutenant colonel, he wanted to be a full eagle. So he scammed off, it was a star unit, he scammed off all the top AGCT scores, which gave us one of the wackiest, brightest outfits you ever saw. And then he worked us to death. We were up at 5 in the morning exercises, march to class. Everybody else was strolling to class with their tie askew or no tie at all, you know, all over the place. And we were going by the numbers. We had a course, there were 2 courses, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday in the school chapel, which was the largest place, was geography. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday was history. We went in there the first Monday, and we were always either starving to death or out on our feet, which meant the minute you sat down, you fell asleep. So we got into these very uncomfortable benches in the doggone chapel, and after a while, a bald-headed man climbed up in the pulpit, adjusted the microphone, and began to read his notes to us in a dead monotone, and we all went to sleep. We slept nicely through the hour. We came in Tuesday, which was history. And we didn't wait. We settled down, and believe it or not, if you're expert, you could even cuddle up on a stiff wooden bench without appearing to flop over sideways. And a fat, untidy man with gray hair flying and his stomach bulging climbed up into the pulpit, fiddled with the microphone, and everybody was just about half asleep. And he leaned forward into the microphone, and his first words were, "You're ignorant." And everybody woke up. And his next words were, "I'm ignorant too, but I'm not as ignorant as you are." And he went on to develop his thesis, which was for that day, that ignorance is not having the information. Stupidity is refusing to take advantage of the information when it is offered to you. The man was tremendous. However, as I said, we had a very snarky bunch, and a deputation of some of our hardheads waited on the colonel the next day saying, "We are captive soldiers in the U.S. Army. We are here against our will, essentially. Why should we have to endure being insulted from the platform?" And the colonel said, "This is outrageous. We will do something about it." Charged down, apparently, to the head of the college, who said, "Don't you realize this is the one good man we have? He could be teaching at Harvard. He happens to like it here. God knows why." Well, we stuck with him. 6 months later, when we were all sent back into the real army, another deputation weighed on him to have him come over and tell us what he thought was going to happen. The man was a delight. He was in love with history. You get him off on a sidelight. Ask him about Benjamin Franklin's private life, and his ears would wiggle. If any of you know Benjamin Franklin's private life, you'll understand why.
And that is Gordy's final, very brief word.